this is not a traditional view of what broadleaf does. So if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong class. What I wanted to do is kind of take a different approach and talk about what's the workforce composition of a typical client, and then we'll talk through a little bit about what's happening in the industry, those different workforce classification makeups, and then that hopefully will tie back to the solutions that we offer and maybe make a little bit more sense around some of those solutions. So we're going to look at a company in its aggregate, in whole. So let's imagine this beautiful circle that I just drew is a company. So we can name that company. Anybody? Moog. All right, that's actually a really good one to work with. So how big is Moog, roughly? Anybody know?
Big. I don't have a clue.
10,000 people? Is it that big?
Yeah, it's right around there.
All right, we're going to say Moog is 10,000 people. So 10,000 employees makes up Moog's, what we'll call the full-time employment base, okay? So if this is Moog in totality, what we know is that it's not all full-time employees, right? Moog has lots of different types of people in there. The rough statistics on that are that roughly 60% of that workforce is full-time, okay? And the reason we know that is because the industry says that about 40% today of an average company is working in a contingent fashion, non-employee base, right? That number is going to grow. I think by 2020 it's supposed to be 50%. By 2022 or 2025 it's going to be closer to 60%, okay? So if half the employment base or a little bit more is full-time, the other 40% is not. So what does that look like? If we're talking about non-traditional employment, we have what? What are some of the contingent
Independent contractor?
typers? Yep, we have independent contractors, which are part of what? Something. All right.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of different pieces here. Okay. SIA has told us that about 20%, 20 to 25% of a typical company makes up temporary labor, right? So temp. Okay, that number's up from about 3%. So if you look back in history, 15, closer to 20 years ago, back when I started in the industry, that number was much, much smaller. So let's just put a little tick here at 3%, okay? Why do you think it's gone from 3% to 20%?
Cost of insurance and benefits. And
Insurance, benefits, who pays those?
the employer.
The employer of record, right? So on a temp side, that's who?
You guys or the staffing firm.
The staffing firm versus the full-time employees, right, that sit over here. What are some of the other reasons that a company would want to grow their temporary base from 3 to 20%?
Easier to staff up and down.
Right, more flexibility in going up and down. What happens when you let go of full-time employees?
You have to
Unemployment.
Unemployment, you often have severance, but what else? What's a big thing when you guys?
Reputation.
Lawsuits.
Reputation. Lawsuits, yeah, reputation, your marketplace, your employment brand, right? So when an employer had 3% and they wanted to flex up and down this remaining 17%, that was a direct hit to their full-time employment base in terms of their reputation, in terms of the cost to disposition those people, in terms of the unemployment costs that they had to pay to their individual states for those releases, right? What happened maybe 15 years ago to make that shift start to happen? There are workers that always wanted full-time work, right? So this number used to be closer to 97, 90%. But now the workforce is 60. So we know why the employers did it, right? But what changed in the last 15 years? What are some of the things that changed that would shift the mindset of the employee to want to move to this percentage of temp labor? Any ideas?
Technology.
Technology change, so what?
Well, I mean, it kind of, I guess, funnels into it, but just a change of the work scene environment, you never used to have freelancing or working from home or more options, I guess, would be
Yeah.
Flexibility.
the bigger category.
Worker want flexibility. What happened from an employer standpoint that made employees change their mindset about, like maybe your parents, right? My parents
Pensions.
wanted to work for companies for their entire career. Why?
Pensions.
Pension. What happened 15 years ago?
Stop retiring.
They didn't ever stop retiring, right? Oh, I wish. And everybody eventually has to retire, but employers did what? They wiped out pensions,
Yeah.
right? IBM was one of the leading companies in terms of global employment, and they wiped out pension plans, right? Along with IBM, all of a sudden, all the big Fortune 100s looked at that and said, wow, this is one huge way to eliminate a huge overhead cost of the organization, because it's not just the cost of an active employee and the payroll benefits and all that. They were carrying 10, 20% of their overhead to pay residual commission or pension funds for these exited employees, right? So when that started to go away, employees said, well, what's the benefit for me to stay at this company for 20 years anymore? Now, there's still companies that have that, government, or primarily governments, and then a handful of others. But the shift started to say, hey, it's on you, employee, to figure out how it is that you're gonna fund your retirement, right? So two things happening. Employers saying, I want flexibility, up and down. Employees saying, I don't really need to stay here 20 years anymore. I have to manage my own compensation and ultimately my own retirement anyway, right? So that's what drove that space over the last 15 to 20 years. Now, along with that, a big mindset change in what qualified as a temp. Temporary workers were historically viewed as underperformers, right? The redheaded stepchild, the second tier employee versus a full-time worker, because if you couldn't get full-time work, you did temporary work. But because now, instead of 3 in 10, now you have, or I'm sorry, 3 in 100, now you have 20 to 25 in 100 of your workforce, it starts to shape a culture completely differently, right? If you sat in a room of 100 people and 3 weren't your employees and 97 were, those 3 can't really make a big difference in how that organization looks and how they act and how they look at labor a different way. But now, 1/4 of your population, 25% of that room is not your employee, and that starts to change the way that an organization looks, right? Okay?
Is there a maximum amount of time that a person can be considered a temp? Like, at what point are companies not allowed to?
It's a great,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. The answer to that is there's no defined statute on the length of any type of employment, regardless of what your classification is. But with that being said, there are lots of companies that have what we call tenure limits. And the reason that those exist is because, we're gonna talk about another category here. IC, or 1099, okay? An independent contractor, which is a W-9, a person that receives a W-9, somebody that self-classifies themselves as a 1099, is a worker classification that started about 20 years ago. And it was these temporary workers that said, hey, I'm working for a Cara or a Manpower or a Deco, or maybe I used to be working for Microsoft or IBM, and now they've cut my pensions, so I'm trying to employ myself a different way. And they came back as temporary or individual workers under a 1099 status. What's the advantage of a 1099 status?
For the employer.
If you were a 1099, or if I was a 1099 versus being a temp or a full-time, what's the advantage to me?
Kind of run your own business at that point, right?
Run your own business, but there's another implication, a reason why people want that. Any ideas?
Can you hold or work for multiple companies?
You do, I mean, you should work for multiple companies. That's part of one of the criteria.
Is it tax deferred?
It's a
Yeah.
tax reason. If I'm a 1099 and I receive an hourly wage or payment for my services, I withhold my own taxes, right? I am my employer and my employee, And everybody, every W-2 worker has two sides to taxes. If you're an employee of Aileron, which all of us are one of the companies of Aileron pays part of your tax burden. Now, you still pay a tax burden, right? Comes out of every check, and it really stinks. But the employer is also paying a percentage, and that percentage, depending on the state, can be as much as 17%. Maybe, and there's a few states that might be a little higher, but roughly 17%. So if I was earning $100 an hour, and my employer is taking 17% of that, right? And then the state is taking another 35% of that. I'm losing, what is that, 52%, right? But the employers were paying 17, so you received the $100 less your 35% federal state tax, right? As a 1099, I collect $100, I still owe all that same amount of tax, but I'm the one holding that money and earning interest on it, and then I'm paying those taxes when I report my income at the end of the year. Technically, they're supposed to do it along the year, but the reason that you're a 1099 is you're holding it, and then what are you doing? You're writing off everything you possibly can, right? I'm writing off my place of work, I'm writing off my car, my telephone, everything I can to show that my income is lower, so I can keep as much of that $100 an hour as I possibly can. So that number, that started back in the 90s, early 90s, as a new worker classification. Today, that represents somewhere between 10 and 15% of the workforce. True, just individual 1099 workers. But something big happened not too long after that that became a landmark case that made 1099s suspect for a lot of companies to use. Anybody know what that was? Microsoft. Yeah. So Microsoft essentially said, we don't want, this is back when Microsoft was really taking off, still relatively, small in terms of the company size, and Microsoft was growing rapidly and their stock price was going through the roof. And instead of wanting to pay all these people profit share or stock share on all the business that are all their growth, they employed 1099s, because as a 1099, you're not eligible for benefits from the employer, right? So they hired hundreds and hundreds of these 1099s and said, sure, I'll pay you $100 an hour, Logan. I have no problem with that. And you're gonna sit here and you're gonna do all this coding and help Microsoft build the next version of Windows or Office or whatever it is, right? But what happened is they treated these people the same as they treated their own workers. And so after a few years, when the stock price went from $50 to $100, all these 1099s sat there scratching their head and said, yeah, okay, I made my $100 and I didn't have to pay taxes like I would have as an employee, but I lost out on hundreds of thousands of dollars of equity by being an employee, but yet I sit right next to Catherine, who's an employee doing the exact same thing, getting the exact same direction. She's getting this stock share and I'm not, right? So this case, and this is again, almost 15 to 20 years ago now, was worth $160 million that they had to pay this group of people. So it became the landmark defining case for 1099s, right? So now all of a sudden there's a lot of scrutiny around the use of 1099s. So we're gonna get back to that when we talk about our solutions. Okay, so we have temps, which are W-2, we said those come from suppliers, right? Those are W-2 suppliers. We have 1099s. What makes up the rest of this pie? Part-time would still be a temp.
Contingent?
Contingent, this is still part of that contingent piece.
Mhm.
Any idea on what kind of contingent? No? Okay. This is a bucket that we call statement of work. Statement of work. Okay. We don't really know, I mean, other than if you deduct 25 and 15, right? So 40%, the remaining piece is SOW. But we don't really know what number of people this makes up within Moog. Why? Why is that? Anybody know? Any ideas? No? Okay, so if I'm a temporary worker, I'm an individual with a head count, right? If I'm a 1099, I'm a registered worker with a head count. If I'm a statement of work and I'm Moog, what does a statement of work mean?
Is it vendors, like outside vendors?
They're outside vendors that are working under a statement of work, or what's another word for statement of work?
Contract?
Project?
A project, exactly. So when I outsource work to a project vendor, an SOW vendor, the whole precipice for that is that there's a deliverable that I have to deliver if I'm that outsourced provider. And that deliverable is subject to whatever the deliverable is and not what the people associated with that are, right? So if I outsource to you an implementation of an SAP platform, I don't care if it takes you one person, 10 people, or 100 people. What I care about is that you're delivering whatever it is that I've outsourced to you, okay? Same way that they outsource to us, let's say an RPO project, an outsourced recruitment project. It's not up to them to tell us how many people we assign to that project. We're held to deliverables, right? And the deliverables dictate whether we receive payment or we don't. So in this bucket, we're not tracking the headcount necessarily associated, but we know that out of these categories, that's what makes up the rest of the pie, okay? Make sense? Okay, so now let's talk about temps, because you brought up part-time workers, right? Temps make up a few different categories too. We have a sliver in here that we call payroll, right? What are payroll workers?
They work for the staffing company. The staffing company pays them, they're employees of the staffing company.
But what makes them different than a temp? No ideas?
Do they have more of a full-time role?
No, same, right? The only difference here between these, they are temps, but they were identified by the client themselves, right? So we still have them if we actually coded this, right? These are part of the same bucket, but we segregate them because there's less effort to get a payroll worker involved in a project, because Moog is saying, hey, I want Catherine to come and perform temporary services for me. But since I've identified Catherine, I don't want to pay a traditional staffing company to go and do the recruitment, right? So I'm going to categorize them as a temp. They're a W-2 worker, but I'm not going to pay the same amount of money that I pay for a W-2 worker, right? Now within the temporary, there's all kinds of different skill sets, right? This is how we serve our customers. If I'm Moog and 20 to 25% of my workforce is temp, I'm probably using what? Admins, engineers, mechanics, field techs, instrumentation people, right? Pretty much any skill set that you use over here, you would also use over here, right? So how do we get these temps? How does Moog get these temps? It's 20 to 25% of their workforce. How do they get them?
By partnering with staffing companies?
By staffing, right? All of this is staffing. Okay, now there might be, I don't know how many disciplines they have there. Might be 10, might be 20, might be 3, right? But all those different disciplines are filled by staffing companies, okay? How do people, we already said here, these are self-identified. Okay, how do they find 1099s?
Both staffing and sourcing?
Could be, yeah, could be either. Generally, think about the Microsoft case, right? What happened was they had programmers that were their employees, and they said, the employees said, yeah, I don't want to work in that capacity. So I was a known quantity to the organization. I changed my worker classification, and now I'm doing work directly back for the client. So for the most part, these are, I'm using self, but it's really client. Client identified, right? So I already know Catherine's a great writer. I worked with her already at Moog. I want her to work for me, but Catherine doesn't want to work as a W-2 through a temp agency, so she's going to come in as a 1099. But isn't she still really just a temp? right? She's still really just in that temp population, so she's really part of that same wedge. Okay? Does that make sense, all that? Okay, so that leaves us with this, right? And this is what we said, we're loosely calling full-time employees, okay? Not everybody's full-time, but they're full-time employees, meaning they get a W-2 from Moog, okay? Anyone that gets a W-2 is in this bucket, anyone that doesn't get a W-2 is in one of these buckets, right? So, just like temp staffing, there's a whole bunch of different labor categories in here, right? And how do they get those people? How does Moog hire all their employees?
Their own recruiting efforts?
Their own recruiting, yeah. Ah. We call that group talent acquisition, right? It's their internal recruitment that's outsourcing and finding their own talent, okay? How else can they find these people?
Hire an outside vendor to get them to recruit for them. And then
Right.
just have them on their, you know.
Well, that'd be a temp.
versus-
Oh, you mean if they brought them in as a full-time?
Right,
Yeah, so what do we call that, do you know?
direct hire.
Direct hire, sort of, yeah.
Direct placement.
Direct placement.
Is there a difference?
It is, because I'll explain that in just a second. Okay, how else?
Just referrals, connections in the industry.
Sure, referrals, right? What else? RPO, recruitment process outsourcing. So if I'm not doing it internally, I'm doing it externally, right? So all of these solutions, again, can be grouped because this is internal and all of these are external. So let me explain the difference here. A direct placement, there's different ways that you can do that. When you're looking for a senior level executive, what do they often do when they go outside and they ask somebody to go find that person? You guys know what that is?
Like what it's called.
Yeah, if I was looking for a headhunter specifically to find the chief marketing officer for Moog, what might I go hire?
An executive search firm.
An executive search firm. So this direct placement actually has little subgroups to it. There's executive search, right? And that executive search firm probably isn't going to take that job without a retained. So executive search often is also called retained search. Okay? The other way might be to engage a temporary staffing company that also does direct placement, right? So you said direct search or direct placement, but that operates under a different principle because they're not getting anything up front. They get paid when?
When they get hired.
When and if they get a hire. So we call that contingent search. Okay, does anybody know why we would call it contingent search?
It's only based on getting somebody hired.
It's contingent on whether you get the hire, right? So I can give as many companies as I want that search parameter, but only the one that gets the hire gets the fee, right? Okay. Referrals really are probably part of full-time talent acquisition. There's probably some referraling program associated there, but it could also be referrals into any of these other mechanisms. Who knows what recruitment process outsourcing is?
Is it just when when an outside firm does everything for you, and then the client is the final decision maker?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to look at it. It's another way to get your full-time hires through an outside provider, right? But even within RPO, there are different models, okay? So the first way that an RPO can be engaged is just like you said, Catherine, that I could take a sliver of my full-time and I can give it to an RPO partner. And they're going to go and they're gonna start with the sourcing, do the screening, do the qualifying, present the candidates, and ultimately the candidate ends up where? In this full-time bucket, okay? But another way that an RPO might work is like this, okay? And so maybe if I'm the full-time acquisition team or the talent acquisition team, I might need some help in the process. I don't want to give you the whole sliver. I might want to give you a piece of the sliver, okay? So what would that be like? Any ideas? Think about the recruitment process.
Sourcing.
What?
Just do the sourcing.
Just do the sourcing. So if you think about the talent acquisition life cycle, right, there are stages to it. We start with a requisition, and we have to find people, we have to qualify people, we have to screen the people, we have to interview the people, and then we hire the people, right? So any of those parts of the process could be taken away from talent acquisition and put into an RPO, okay? So we can slice RPO different ways, horizontally, vertically, whatever we want to do there, to provide support to that full-time acquisition team. What we really want are these two teams to basically be aligned as the same, okay? Why do you think that is?
More efficient.
More efficient, yeah.
Kind of establishes the culture that you're looking for and a certain candidate that you want to bring in.
Right, exactly. If we're an outsourced provider, we want to replicate and look just like the in-source provider, right? We don't want the candidate to have two different experiences, because what if I'm a talent acquisition recruiter and I'm recruiting an engineer, and my RPO provider is also recruiting an engineer, maybe it's for a different location, and we're doing it differently. And we're calling saying we're broadleaf, and they're calling saying they're Moog. What's the candidate experience?
Bad.
Yeah.
It's confusing.
Right.
Who's recruiting for what, right? Okay. What's the difference between an RPO and a retained search, contingent search, or any kind of direct placement?
It sounds like an RPO, it should be fully integrated.
Fully integrated, yep.
And it's
Some-
part of a larger strategy than just hire this position or.
Part of a larger strategy, yep. Anything else?
It's almost like if you hire, for this group, a marketing agency, and they do almost all of your marketing on a consistent basis, that would be more of the RPO model
Yep.
versus a project that a marketing agency might do for a one-time project that they might do.
Yeah, I mean, all good points. The biggest difference between these is ownership. If I'm a contingent search company, what did we already say? I could give it to as many companies as I want and only one company gets the fill, right? And that company that gets the fill isn't guaranteed or none of the companies are guaranteed the fill, right? If I'm an RPO company, number one, I have to have exclusivity because I'm representing talent acquisition. I can't be competing with these other options because now my candidate experience is what? I'm getting called by contingent search, I'm getting called by retained search, and I'm getting called by what appears to be my internal talent acquisition, even though it might not be. Who am I supposed to work with to get the job?
Right.
Right? So one of the requirements of RPO is that it's an exclusive opportunity to represent the client just like you are the client, right? Okay, so that's the different ways that work comes in as a full-time. Now there's one other strategy that companies are using now, and had I reordered this differently, it would look a little different, but it sits right here. Okay, can anybody guess what that is?
MSP?
That's a solution, but think about ways that companies are bringing in full-time, right? Still part of the full-time, but what are ways that companies are bringing in talent into full-time without doing RPO, direct placement, or talent acquisition?
Converting temp into full-time?
That's right, temp to perm, or temp, let's not use perm. Temp to FTE, right? So if this temp piece were down here, it'd probably be a little better. But the idea is a try before you buy, right? I've already engaged, and I'm already paying for them to be here. If I like them, I don't need to go out and source other talent. I might as well just bring them into the organization, right? So those are the different ways that you can go into the full-time. Make sense? Okay, so let's go back over to temp. I'm Moog, I have 10 different labor classifications, and I'm using staffing companies, right? What happens if I open an administrative position and an engineering position and I send them to the same staffing company?
They may not have the specialty.
They may not have the specialty. What happens if I send it to the same admin position that's in Buffalo, and I have another admin position in California, and I send it to the same staffing company?
They may not have a strong presence in both of those markets.
Right, in the geography, right? So let's take this little piece of temp, this little wedge of temp, and blow it up. All of a sudden, I have this small piece of the pie, right, with different functions and different geographies, okay? So every box in here has to get sent to suppliers. Are they the same supplier? Maybe, but maybe not, right? And so all of a sudden, I have to map a whole bunch of suppliers to different jobs in different geographies, right? So can you see how quickly that could blow up? Now that's if I'm only doing one supplier, right? What are the odds that if I send a mechanical engineering position in Rochester to one supplier that I'm gonna get the job filled within 3 to 5 business days? I don't know. Might be good,
Right, yeah.
but it might not, right? So what do companies want?
Someone to just handle
More
it
suppliers.
for them.
They want more suppliers. Why?
Better chance of filling the position quicker.
Better chance of filling the position. So now I'm gonna take one job, right? I'm one lonely job, like a bill. There's that song, right? And what am I gonna do? I'm gonna send it out at least 4 suppliers, right? Okay, so now think about all those different jobs and all those geographies that are going out to exponentially different suppliers. What happens to that supply tree? It gets gigantic, right? And who has to manage that? If I'm Moog, who's managing that today? I mean, not today because we're out. We picked a client of ours, but if they weren't a client of ours, who would be managing that?
Someone internally, ultimately.
Probably bunches of people,
Yeah.
right? Maybe not managed at all,
Right.
right? Because what happens for you to do business as a supplier to fill a job, what do you have to do?
Go through an RFP process.
Maybe, I mean, you at least have to have a contract, right? So you have to have a contract, you have to have your POs set up, you have to be able to then talk to a manager that tells you I have a job, right? So now there's 3 people already from the client that are involved in the process for each supplier, each job, each location, okay? So now let's go back to this piece here, right? And how do we help clients with that?
Just take it over.
We take it over, but what do? We
Implement an MSP.
implement an MSP, right? Why? What does an MSP do?
Manages all the different suppliers?
Manages a lot of different suppliers, yep. What else?
It allows them to control costs and resources internally.
Yep,
Provide data on the hiring?
gives them information, yep, absolutely. right? So think about exponentially how many suppliers this was creating, and what do they get when we level insert an MSP?
Just one supplier to deal with.
You get a layer, yeah, between.
Right. So regardless of how many jobs, right, and how many suppliers, if I'm the client, what do I see?
Just whatever the MSP
Yeah,
is doing.
I see the MSP, and I don't have to see all this, right? Okay. Payroll, we already said, is an identified worker by the client. So, what does the MSP do?
Take care of the payroll.
It just brings them in and aggregates them along with the rest, right? Okay, let's talk a little bit about independent contractors. We said that they create a lot of risk, right? Because of the implications back to the client. What's another risk factor associated with 1099s? I said earlier, if I made $100 an hour and I withheld my taxes to the end of the year, who else cares about that besides the client that maybe is sitting here saying, hey, are you gonna sue me for my benefits or potentially stock? Who else cares about that?
Government.
The government. Who specifically?
The IRS.
The IRS. Why?
Because they want their money.
They want their money, right? How, have we been in a surplus in the government anytime recently? Not that I know of, right? So what's happening here is we have a huge IRS initiative to go after these 1099 workers. Why? Because what did I say earlier? I'm supposed to be filing taxes throughout the year. I'm earning wages, I'm supposed to be declaring that I'm earning wages, and the employer wasn't paying the employer taxes. So I should have been paying my employer taxes along the way, but I haven't, because I'm a 1099, I'm trying to defer it as long as I can. When I get to the end of the year, maybe I didn't pay it at all. I might hold those taxes as long as I can until they come and get me, right? So this has become a big issue because what the IRS has said is there are billions of dollars of unpaid employer and employee side taxes that aren't being collected. And they have to go and they have to chase it, okay? So if I'm Dave's Consulting Inc., and I choose not to go and pay my taxes, and the IRS, bless you, and the IRS has to chase me down, is that very efficient for them?
No.
No. So what do you think they're doing?
They're just not doing it.
No, they want their money.
They're
They're regulated.
forcing the companies to take care of it for them.
They're coming back to the employer.
Probably finance are better.
I know.
They don't care.
Yeah, they don't really care at all.
Yeah,
They're-
but
they're
you're-
If you have a
coming back-
1099 here too, I wish they didn't.
They're going
care.
back to Moog and saying, hey Moog, do you have any of these workers? And if you do, are you actually making sure that they're paying their taxes? Because guess what? All I have to do as Dave's Consulting LLC is file what? If I owe a big tax bill and I've spent it because I took my $100 an hour and I went and bought myself a new car, what do? I file bankruptcy, right? So then the government never gets their money. So what are they doing? They're going back to the employer that isn't the employer of record, but is using the services, and they're saying, hey, is Dave really performing as a 1099 legitimately? And we'll talk about the definition of that in a later session. And if not, what are you doing to make sure that we're getting our share of the money? Okay? So the IRS now has basically said, okay, if we find any, we're gonna make sure that you're audited, and out of the audits, almost always, there's fees, right? Because the IRS doesn't ever leave for free. So there's gonna be some kind of fees and penalties, right? So our clients have basically said, help me, because in our mind, we've outsourced this. We don't want to manage that. That's why they're not full-time employees, right? So we extend our MSP services to help them there as well, okay? And the way we do that is by compliance testing and making sure that these 1099s actually meet the criteria to perform. And if they do, then what happens? Technically nothing.
Right.
They get to perform the services. However,
You feel better about that.
we feel much better about them. That's very true. But the other thing that happens is then they fall into this bucket. okay? Why? Why would Dave's Consulting Inc. or LLC now become part of the SOW bucket? Any ideas?
They're just worried about what the 1099s deliver to them, they don't really care about
It's
anything
usually
else.
project-based
Absolutely
and
right.
specific services.
You guys are smart.
Well, I freelance, so.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, there's a lot of
Sadly.
criteria,
No, I know.
but in the end, a 1099 should not look like a W-2 temp taking direction day to day, hour to hour, and time being paid hour by either a staffing company or by the employer, right? So in our mind, that becomes a statement of work, okay? So now I've expanded my services here. Okay, so now we have statement of work, and statement of work is what we defined earlier, saying, I have a job to do, I need somebody to do it, I don't want to do it myself, I'm Moog, I'm gonna outsource that, right? So who usually does that? Who usually goes and finds suppliers for a client?
Purchasing people.
Purchasing people, right? And so what do? If I needed to outsource the building of 20 helicopters, right? I break it down into components, right? Who's manufacturing parts, who's doing assembly, who's responsible for quality, who's responsible for, whatever, right? On and on and on. So within the SOW, there's sort of a bell curve, okay? There's dollars and value, okay? If I'm Moog and I'm in procurement, I only have so many resources. What am I focused on?
As many as efficiently as possible.
I want to manage what? I want to manage the bulk of the spend, right? The most important stuff and the bulk of the spend. Why is that?
Because I want to make sure they maintain their budget.
It's the most critical part of my organization, right? It's what drives the overall profitability, it's what drives maybe the quality, it's the main components that make up the organization. But on each end of that, we have two other parts, right? Over here we have low dollar and low value, right? Why would I spend my time on that? So typically, that doesn't get managed at all. Most clients don't do anything. If I'm a hiring manager and I need something to be done, I can go out and I can spend money. Maybe this is $50,000, right? Maybe that's my $50,000 threshold. And as long as that PO for these services is less than $50,000, I can go do it all day long and nobody cares, right? Now I hit the sweet spot and procurement comes in, okay? Now I'm at a higher value. Why wouldn't procurement care if I'm way at the end of the value chain? Why is it that procurement isn't focused there?
It takes too many resources, just not enough bandwidth.
Yeah, there's certain things that not everybody can be experts in, right? And if I'm not buying a lot of them, but they're high value, right? I need to find a way to source these and get them without having to stretch my team. So these are the two areas that we typically see SOWs that are needing SOW management, okay? So, does anybody know how we solve that from a broadleaf perspective?
Refer them to SDI.
What? Of course we do, no. Yes, we have two solutions, right? And I'm sort of loosely gonna do this. I know it's getting messy and I apologize. I'll wipe this stuff off. Yeah, we have two solutions. We can bring the MSP along, or we can bring SDI along, okay? When we're talking about that lower end of the value proposition here, right, this piece here, there's not a lot that often happens in that. Our clients often have already decided who they're gonna use, what they're gonna do, and they've already bought the PO, okay? So we, on the MSP side, we call that procure to pay, which means clients already procured it, and they just need a way to pay it or aggregate it, okay? Then there's the higher end strategic, right? Which maybe is a lower volume, but high in value. And we can't just let some manager out there go do that, right? So where do we support that?
Source to
The source to pay, right? We have to go and we have to find vendors and we have to engage qualified vendors and bring them through an RFP or some other process to determine that they're qualified to take that work, right? And bring them in. Now there's one other way to look at SOW, which is, let's see if I do this right. By dollars and volume, okay? So we know that the high dollar, we said, who's servicing those? Primarily the internal procurement, right? But somewhere in here, we said here it was 50,000, but maybe that's not the right number, okay? But somewhere in here, there's a whole bunch of POs for $50,000 or less, right? That are just going out and out and out. And so nobody was managing those, right? That was that beginning of the curve. So when you start to add those up, let's say there's 10,000 POs for $50,000, right? It's a lot of money and nobody's managing it, okay? So maybe we said it's non-strategic spend. We call this the tail, okay? It's the tail that wags the dog. 80% of the POs may be here because it's high quantity but low value. 20% of the POs may be here that are high dollar. Nobody cared about these until we do what? Add them up, right? If you add them all up, and let's say this goes down to 0 or $1, I guess we wouldn't cut a PO for less than $1, right? So somewhere in here is the midpoint. Let's just say it's 25. 25,000 times 10,000, what is that? It's not 250,000. 25,000 times 10 would be 250. Times 10,000 would be what?
Million?
25 million?
Yeah.
Is that right?
This is my
Something like that?
Yeah.
Oh,
We're talking
it's in the
about work
millions,
here.
that's all that matters.
Right?
Yeah.
So is that number important?
No, it's awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so the other reason that we bring in a sourcing strategy is to look at what we call the tail spend and say, let's consider all those POs in aggregate, and if I can go in and get volume spending, because how many of those POs might be alike? We don't know, right? How many of them are buying the same service from the same supplier or different suppliers that we might be able to aggregate? And so just like that supply tree, we might break this down into different suppliers. How many suppliers does it take to make up that $25 million? Okay, so think about the MSP model that we applied to temporary labor and trying to give the client a single point of contact to get all that supply. Now think about the same thing for POs, right? Now I take that and I have an MSP model, right? So my client only has one person that they have to deal with to get all those different POs managed, cut, and drive value, okay? That is the solution between the MSP and SDI. Now, regardless of which company, those things aren't relevant. But the two solutions that are relevant are procure to pay and source to pay. Does that make sense? Okay, so here we said MSP solves temp, payroll, 1099, and now we've expanded over SOW, right? Down here we have this little bit of piece under the temp to full-time. That still falls under temp, right? So that's being managed by the MSP. Here we said RPO, right? So now we're still providing services under broadleaf, right? So now I've got how much of the pie? Big portion, right? Who does direct placement? Akara, yep. I'm gonna make them, well, I used their red, didn't I? I'm gonna make them blue because I can. right? So now I have a Kara. So what does that leave left?
Very small.
A very small piece, right? So what's happened here is we took each category of labor and said, how do we get involved in the client's business and provide value, right? And we've essentially wrapped ourselves around 75% of their business. The only piece that's sitting outside is what they've defined core in their full-time talent acquisition. And even that, we said we might slice a piece this way, right? So we've essentially now wrapped ourselves around the entire client. Does that make sense? That's how we developed our solution wheel.
Well done.
Questions?
Yeah.
Did I go over my hour?
No, you did it down.
absolutely
That was really
perfect.
Good job,
impressive.
Professor.
That was good.
I know.
That was
Right.
right there. That was
This is
cool.
my worst model ever.
Can I take a picture of it?
You can, but we have better ones on paper, right? I think.
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
So, questions
I like
on
this
this?
Yes.